I want us to think about a couple images of discipleship, specifically because we have a fascinating and disturbing image of discipleship that comes from Jesus in the gospel lesson. But I want to cast another image that fits with what Jesus is doing as well before we look at what is said in the Luke passage. It comes from a friend of mine, or I should say a friend's mother who was also a friend. This was a woman, she died last month, and her and her husband moved into the house behind ours with their two kids. Their son, Eric, was close to my age, and we grew up together, going to school together, playing together. And their daughter, Stacy, was my younger brother's age, and they became best friends as well. And their mom, Penny, who died last month, had a significant impact on my life. And the story of Penny kind of goes like this. Her and her husband moved in. Her husband was a truck driver, so he would be around for 2 or 3, 4 days, and then he'd be gone for 1 to 2 weeks, long hauling. He owned his own semi-cab, and then would come back for 3 or 4 days and be gone for 1 to 2 weeks, and so forth. And Penny, so for the most part, was kind of a single parent, but she also worked at a local manufacturing plant called Rockford Product, which produced nuts, bolts, screws, and things like that. So she worked on a line, kind of piecework on the line, which could be a very physical, hard job. And when we were in later grade school, and I've done sleepovers at Eric's house, and he at mine, and Eric loved race tracks and trains, and I love trains, and we had all kinds of stuff in common. He influenced me into loving to play with semi-trucks because his dad has a semi, and I started building semi-models as he did because of that. Well, in late grade school, an event happened that changed our life and their life. Penny, when she was a young girl, got polio. And she survived polio without any adverse effects and had a really good life after surviving that. She was at work one day, and she suddenly felt incredibly exhausted. And she felt so exhausted that she wasn't sure she would be able to make it through the day. So she went on a break and went and got pop with a lot of caffeine and a candy bar and pumped herself full of caffeine and sugar just to get through her shift. She managed to get through her shift, got to her car, drove home, walked in the house, into the living room, sat down in the recliner, put the recliner back, and figured, I'm going to take a nap, and in an hour or two I'll be okay. Well, she fell asleep, woke up the next morning paralyzed from the neck down. And what she had is a syndrome that is a side effect of polio. So a very small percentage of people who get polio get this syndrome. And the syndrome affects you in one of two ways. Either it gradually, over weeks to months, paralyzes you, but then the recovery is quick and you usually have a full recovery, or it comes on overnight and you may never fully recover. So she began 6 months of intensive therapy, and she got pretty much the full use of her upper body and arms back, but always struggled with the legs. She could walk with the crutches that wrapped around her arm, but not for real long distances, but she could get herself up and walk around. So she ended up having her life be set in a wheelchair. Now, she was a cool person because in our neighborhood with my friends, all of their moms treated us like their kids when we were at their house. And we were their kids. And they helped raise us. I had one friend's mom who actually taught us manners. When you sit at the table, this is how you sit. This is where the napkin goes. This is when you say please. And they treated us all like their kids when they were at their house. My mom did the same for my friends. And so Penny was a significant influence on my life. What made Penny unique was she was the one mom we knew we could go to and talk to about anything, even if we felt we couldn't talk to our own parents. And that was one of her gifts. And so she was suddenly paralyzed, which became a problem because she has a husband who's a truck driver. And so that began this course of trying to figure out how to adjust her life. And my mom and dad helped out, and other friends in the neighborhood helped out, and different neighborhood pool to help out, help her deal with the kids. Her own parents were living in town, so they helped out. And so a whole, kind of the neighborhood rallied around to help them as she began this journey of doing rehab and figuring out how to recover from this. And her dad took their porch and cut out a space and built an elevator so that you could wheel a wheelchair on from the driveway, put a door in at ground level, and you wheel in and you hit a button, which us as kids thought was the coolest thing in the world. And she would ride up the elevator and could get into the house. And she worked hard at that therapy, but never got to the point where she gained full control of her body back. About 6 months after this, when she is recovering, but not quite completely recovered, and is struggling with this and is figuring out how to kind of be single parent, etc., they're home one day, and the upstairs, they had a house, and the attic got converted into the master bedroom, and the husband did it himself and beautifully lined it with cedar. So the room smelled gorgeous, looked gorgeous, had bookcases all around it, and all of this stuff. And she hadn't been able to use it. And they're downstairs in the living room one day, and someone smells smoke. And old wiring in the house caught on fire and ruined that room. Luckily, they got out. We were outside playing and heard fire trucks and wanted to go see the fire trucks until we realized that's Eric's house. Luckily, everyone was safe, and it didn't damage the structure, and the insurance came in and repaid for it at one point. But that became the last straw for her husband to come home, discover that. He packed up his stuff and left, and never came back. So 6 months into this, her husband walked out on her. What's interesting is she's a Christian. And believe it or not, she struggled, and struggled with her faith. Struggled with questions of, why did this happen? All of it. How am I going to deal with my kids as a single parent? How am I going to get through this? What am I going to do with my life? What was cool about Penny, though, is she hit a turning point where she realized, I could sit here and pity myself. I could sit here and be depressed. And instead, she said, here's where I'm at. Here's my circumstances. How do I move forward? And she began figuring out how to create a life for herself in a wheelchair. She actually began taking care of children. When her kids grew up, left the house, and had kids, she became the caretaker of those kids. Sort of ran an in-home daycare. Friends of theirs would bring their kids, and she would take care of them. And in that wheelchair, she figured out how she could take care of lots of kids and kids' kids. And for about 25 years, she spent her life taking care of infants through toddlers until school age. Then when her father died and her mother's health went bad enough to the point where her mother couldn't take care of herself, she sold her house, moved in with her parents into her parents' house, and started taking care of her mom. This is a woman who's in a wheelchair, who has to use crutches to get up, and she had to get her mother up, bathe her, dress her, and sometimes even help feed her, and she did the whole thing from her wheelchair. And what was amazing is when you would sit and talk with her, she never, oh, God was mean to me, God was bad to me. That was never part of her conversation. What she saw is, okay, here's where things are at. How can I help other people from in my wheelchair? How can I use my life to make a difference in other people's? And she spent 25, 30 years doing that. We learned a lot from her. She figured out when it was time how to drive a car again, and she would take us places. And when we were teens and couldn't drive, and she would take us places, we learned a lot. Like when you're pushing it through a mall in a wheelchair, no one will look at you. Oh, they got someone in a wheelchair. And we used to have fun with that. We'd steer toward crowds of people just to watch them all. Oh, it's someone in a wheelchair. Or the number of times we would be coming up to the handicap parking, and they're all taken, and you would just sit there and wait, and here would come some guy running out and get in his car and drive away. And the number of people who had no need for a handicap spot who used it because they didn't want to walk because they were in a hurry. And it was amazing to see that kind of stuff. But the thing that was so cool about Penny is that she turned that corner and said, so what if I'm in a wheelchair? How can I use my life to make a difference in other people's? How can I let God work through me for other people? That's one vision of discipleship. Jesus shows us another. And in some ways, it's an uncomfortable, it's a really uncomfortable vision. It is and it isn't. He's walking along and he's realized, I'm making that turn toward Jerusalem. What that means is in Jesus' mind, he knows, there's not going to be anything pleasant about this. And he becomes completely focused on that to the point where people people must have been able to see how concentrated it was. You know, when you can see someone walking down the street sometimes and tell, oh, they're not paying attention to this. They're somewhere else. So whatever was going on, he had that kind of look and presence about him that people could see it. And he sends a couple disciples into a Samaritan village, and Jesus had been in a wonderful relationship with the Samaritans. The Jews really hated the Samaritans, and Jesus had wonderful relations with them. And the disciples go, and the people in the village see how focused on Jerusalem he is, that they wouldn't even open their doors to him. And what's fascinating is his disciples come back to Jesus, and they say, can we call down fire and smite them? You know, it's amazing if you think about that. Can we call down fire and smite this village because they wouldn't accept Jesus? Which, here is Jesus near the end of his ministry, and his whole goal is to help them understand who God is and what God is about. He's been trying to get them to see that God is a God of love, and here they want to use power to smite people for not giving Jesus a place to sleep for the night. And what does Jesus do? He rebukes them. And rebuke is not a light word. He chews them out. You're missing it. You're not getting it. That you want to power over. And what you get in the disciples, it's real simple. They're not getting that what Jesus is about is giving his life over for others, serving others, loving others, caring for others. They're seeing Jesus as, he's the Messiah, and we're with him, so we're going to be somebody because we're the disciples. And let's use that power to show people we're the disciples. And totally missing everything he's about. So he turns around and uses a teaching moment. And he has three interactions in this teaching moment that are powerful and disturbing. He has a person that he says, comes to him and says, I will follow you. And Jesus' first response is, foxes have no holes. The birds have no nests. If you're following me, you will have no place to lay your head. In other words, if you want to hold on to things too much, it won't work to follow God. Or another way to think about it that's more uncomfortable, we get tied to our house. If you're holding on to your house too tightly, you may not see where God is calling you and can't let go when you need to let go. But really what Jesus is pushing this person is, how tightly are you holding on to things? And how loosely are you that you can let go and go where God needs you? That's a tough challenge. Then he turns around and says to another person, follow me. And the man's response is, first, can I go home and bury my dad? My dad just died. And Jesus says, let the dead bury the dead. You need to go proclaim the kingdom. That's not comfortable. That is a very, very uncomfortable thing. Let the dead bury the dead. How much are you holding on to people in ways that you should or shouldn't be? That's tough. Nothing easy. Then he turns around and a person comes up, I will follow you, Lord, but first let me go say farewell to all the people of my home. Let me run home real quick and say goodbye, because this is a life-changing thing for me. And Jesus pulls out that farming analogy. Anyone who puts their hand to the plow and lets go to look back is unworthy of the kingdom. In other words, you're plowing with those horses pulling, and you need to plow in a straight line. If you take one hand off, you're going to wreck the plow, and you may wreck a major chunk of the field because you won't be able to keep it straight. And in one swift moment, Jesus says three profound things about what it means to follow him. Are you holding on to things too tightly? Are you holding on to people too tightly? Are you holding on to patterns and habits too tightly that you can't go and move where God is calling you to go and move? Or to put it another way, how would your life be different if you didn't have faith in Jesus? Would your life look different today than it does now if Jesus was not a part of your life? That's really what he's asking the disciples. How do you